This particular session is called The Inner Light, which of course is the title of one of the shorter poems that Farrukh had translated. But a quick round of introduction, not that Farrukh needs any, but purely as a matter of protocol. Farrukh Dhondy is a British Indian, maybe British Indian oblique Parsi writer of fiction, drama for screen and stage, as well as journalism. His published works include the autobiographical memoir, Fragments Against My Ruin, and 2 books of translations from the Persian verse of Rumi. And if I recall correctly, there's a 3rd volume of translations as well, which is on the way. So, Farrukh, a very warm welcome to Canto. And I guess I'd start by asking you a pretty fundamental and basic question about translation, the process of translation itself, and the particular method in which you approached it. I mean, any kind of a translation obviously involves a dialogue, a very immersive engagement with the text and with the author and by corollary, the period of that particular text. When you were translating Rumi, and this is what I learned from your exchanges as well as the fairly detailed introductions to your books in the translations, in your case, it wasn't necessarily a direct translation from the original Persian, but the process, if I recall correctly, began with your maternal uncle, your mamu, reciting extempore from pure memory, verse after verse, and just completely enthralling you, and you putting that into English, and that's how really the process started. And thereafter, of course, it became far more systematic, and you had Persian-speaking friends in the UK who've helped you translate. But it seems that there's almost a question of, if not interpretation, almost an additional degree of separation from the original, because you're not working from the original text, but somebody's exposition, interpolation, recitation of the original. So tell us a little bit about how that process took shape, and whether this presented any particular challenges, etc., for you.
The Russian poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko said something which would today be deemed rather sexist. He said translations are like women. If they are faithful, they are not beautiful. And if they are beautiful, they are not faithful. And, regardless of the sexist connotation of that, if one says translations should endeavor to be both beautiful and faithful, the problems arise because one is translating from one culture to another. And a language embodies a culture, a whole culture, and assumptions of that culture. Those assumptions have to be taken into account when you are translating from one culture to another. The problem with Rumi is additionally this, that he is not a contemporary. It's not like translating, T.S. Eliot into Spanish. It's like translating it's translating a 13th century poet into 21st century language, and not making it obscure, and trying to stick to the kind of cultural and religious assumptions in Masnavi's, in Rumi's case, as he wrote in the Masnavi, the 24 volumes with 6 volumes in 24 pieces. Um, so translation becomes difficult, and one attempts to try and emulate the form in which he wrote also. There are several translations of Rumi which don't follow the form, which don't even aspire to rhyme and meter, but they just translate into kind of English free verse. And I think that loses something, because the original Rumi, if you hear anybody speaking the Persian, it's in complete iambic pentameter for the most part, and it rhymes all the time. So the beauty of Rumi's verse is um, encased in the meter and the rhyme. And to try and get that right might be slightly different from getting an absolute literal meaning, but still it tries to preserve a balance between the meaning and the beauty.
You cannot even aspire to that unless the whole concept of fidelity is important to you. And this is something that you've spoken about in interviews and in other fora, but particularly for our audience and for viewers of Canto, I want to bring it up again because I think it's very important. The reason why Western audiences particularly know about Rumi is because he has been resuscitated, revived as this kind of pop icon, this kind of cultural icon, with many of the translations sacrificing nuances of subtlety, sacrificing the intricacies of poetic expression, and instead infusing the so-called translations with Americanisms, with colloquialisms, which make Rumi very accessible, but also make it postcard poetry, right, or Facebook poetry. Uh, and you've mentioned somewhere, and I think that story is very important in the context of our discussion. I think your first brush with Rumi were those mistranslations or bad translations, right? And then you had this conversation with Mamo saying, "Who's this Rumi? What kind of rubbish is this?" And he said, "Do you know who Rumi is? What Rumi is?" And then he starts to. I think it'll be great if you relate that story again to set the context.
See, what happened was I was traveling to Australia for some film project, and a friend of mine gave me a book of Rumi poems by an American. And I read it on the plane, and I thought, I can't follow this at all. There's no rhyme and very little reason. And it seemed kind of sort of ridiculous. So I put the book aside. When I came back from Australia, I was living in my mamu's place, my uncle's place, my mother's brother, in Bombay. And we began talking about this and that, and he said, "What's this book you have?" I said, it's all junk." And he said, "What do you mean junk? It's Rumi." And I said, "Yeah, it's I've heard of Rumi all my life, but I tried to read it the first time, and it just seems like a lot of pap." And he said, "How dare you say that?" And he began spot because he learned Persian and he knew Rumi. He knew lots of Rumi by heart, and he began to recite it. I said, "Hang on, that's rhyme and that's iambic pentameter." And he said, "What's iambic pentameter?" And I said, "It's the verse that Shakespeare used a few hundred years later on. It goes pa-pum, pa-pum,
Yes.
pa-pum, 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 pa-pum." And he said, "Yeah, well, it rhymes like that. That's music." And I said, "Say it again. Tell me what it means." And some of the words are kind of Urdu words, and they were like that. So I sort of caught on the meaning, but he gave me a literal translation. And that night, I scribbled it down. That night, I sat up and wrote my first Rumi translated verse. And then I said the next day, "Please tell me some more." And so we sat through several. While I was a week or 10 days in Mumbai, I got him to recite stuff, and that's where the entire endeavor started. But you see, let me talk about um, the fundamental religious mistake that some of the translations make. There are American translations by people who are devoted to the Sufi religion, and they are quite acceptable. But there are others which completely mistake the Sufi idea of the beloved. When you say the beloved in 13th century Sufi religious discourse, what you mean by the beloved is not the girl next door or the person you saw on the metro. You know, the beloved is God, and God is in your heart as far as the Sufis are concerned. The beloved is always the manifestation of the deity, of Allah, of the final of the final energy of the universe. And they say it is within you, it's not outside you, it's not some bearded guy in the heavens. The beloved then is taken by some translators as um, as an earthly creature whom you want a sexual relationship with or a loving relationship with. And that's not the beloved, even though in all Sufi poetry, there, there remains that kind of ambiguity. And you have to keep in mind that when somebody says the beloved, they mean God.
Yeah. Farrukh, that's absolutely fascinating, and I think that deserves a more deeper discussion. Let's get into the concept of Sufi love. I think part of the reason, I hope you'll agree with me, part of the reason that there's been this conflation of Sufi love with the Beat Generation very sexual depiction or narrative of love is because Sufi poetry, be that Hafiz, be that Rumi, be that Amir Khusro, right? They do use erotic imagery or words that are sexual in nature. And I think that is where this entire conflation lies. That is one aspect. The other aspect could be that many of them, for Rumi's standpoint, many of this is actually dedicated to his Khwaja, his Pir, Shamsi Tabriz. In the case of Amir Khusro's Hindawi poetry, much of that is dedicated to his own Pir, which is Nizamuddin Aulia, right? Mohai Pir Par, Nizamuddin Aulia. So it's the beloved, it's the reimagining of the Sufi poet as the beloved of his Khwaja, and it's implying almost a same-sex sort of relationship. I think, would you agree that these are maybe issues that have conflated the understanding of Sufi into something which is sexual, as opposed to something which is tasawwuf, or which is wadatul wujud, which it is the union with God.
Yes, absolutely. The identification of somebody who is your guru, right, who is your teacher, is also called the beloved, but it doesn't mean that there is a sensual relationship between Rumi and Shamsu Tabriz, yeah, or of Amir Khusro and Nizamuddin Aulia, right? He says, I mean, you pray to that name, but that name is the embodiment somehow of God. Now, can I read you one verse which I think
Please,
illustrates that quite rightly? Uh,
please.
uh, Rumi picks up the story of Zuleika and Yusuf, right? They are lovers, and he uses this legendary relationship, a Laila Majnu relationship, a Krishna Gopi relationship. He uses that to get his point of God across. Here it is. It's called the word. Zuleika had a secret. Every word or phrase she spoke in secret ways referred to her beloved Yusuf. If she said, "The moon is out tonight," she meant instead to say she loved him. When she said, "Alo," or "spice," or "bread," her confidants would know that it was code for Yusuf. Every phrase a tribute to his beauty and his ways. You could say, and by now you may have guessed, that Zuleika lived a life that was obsessed. With Yusuf, she had turned the very gift of speech to magic, making meanings drift and making words say what they never meant. The blandest phrases turned to sentiment and thoughts and praise of Yusuf. When she cursed aloud, she meant she wanted time reversed to once again the hour they last met, when parting made her words turn to regret. His was the name that every morning burst from her lips and quenched her every thirst. His name would warm Zuleika in the cold, and just so all believers should be told that when you seek salvation for your soul, you merge into the ocean of the whole. So lover and beloved are the same. your Zulekha is merely Yusuf's name. And even though your linguist thinks it odd, all pronouncements are one. The word is God, the syllable that permeates all things, exploding stars and songs the robin sings.
Beautiful. We'll talk about the specifics of language used in Persian poetry and how you were able to transpose that music as well as the rhyme structure. We'll get to that. But I was just processing something that you said earlier. Again, I'm going back to divine sort of spiritual love, but using motives which are very earthly. And again, I was thinking of Amir Khusro, and on the one hand, he is the lover of his Khwaja or his Pir. But on the other hand, his Khwaja is Mehboob Ilahi, so the beloved of the God. So there is a transitivity of love. Clearly, I am the beloved, I am the lover of my Pir, but my Pir is also the beloved of God. Therefore, by transitivity, all my approaches and all my offerings of love are that of sacred love. There's that feeling there. And I was also, again, talking about Amir Khusro, I was also struck by this particular poem, which is one of the poems. I'm so happy that you read it. This is one of the poems I loved the most in that particular collection, because there is a clear sense of codification, if you will. I mean, the moment we use the word code, we think of Da Vinci Code, but here, right, I'm saying something very innocuous, but I'm actually meaning, my lover's name, or that I love Yusuf, or it could be an appointment for a tryst with Yusuf at such and such time, in an unearthly hour at the edge of the desert. When we think of Persianate literature or ghazals from a subcontinental standpoint, I think the first name, not surprising, that springs to mind is Amir Khusro. And I was trying to find a little bit of an equivalence. So if you permit me, one of his very famous ghazals is, Chashme Maste Ajabe, Zulfe Daraze Ajabe. And right at the end, in the Maqta, he's saying, do not spell out the truth, the naked, bland truth, hak magu. And his advocacy is for secrets, for codes. And where he says, the ghazal ends, right? Razdane ajabe, sahibe raze ajabe, right? So, it's all, the beauty is all in a raz, in the secret. And somebody who knows the raz is the master. And of course, the greatest master of all is the knower of all secrets. It could be his Khwaja or Allah himself. And I was wondering, what is it in Sufi poetry? Because I'm sure you can bring up parallels in the poetry of Hafez, whom you also admire and whom you also have worked on translation from his books. There is this concept of codification, there is this concept of veils, this concept of secret, of you're saying X but you mean Y. And only someone who is seeped in that language can understand what you really mean. Why do you think this is so prevalent in Sufi poetry?
Because, love is an emotion that all human beings know something about. And the devotion that you have should not be part of a ritual of saying a prayer because you learnt it by heart. It should actually encompass that particular emotion because it's the closest and the noblest emotion that a human being can have. Uh, Love is for by parents for their children. Love is sometimes misunderstood in a nationalistic sense, but then love for a partner, uh, somebody you want to share your life with, that sort of love is also the strongest human emotion that you can have. And to translate that into the religious metaphor is what Sufism seeks to do. And one of the most powerful poets in that sense is, yes, Rumi and Khusro, but The poet Hafiz, right, whom I've also translated, is very much into the idea of the beloved, and he even describes the beloved in several poems as a woman with golden tresses, with charming tresses, and how he's falling for her hair and so on. It's no wonder Muslim women have to cover their heads, uh, because hair is taken as a kind of sexual symbol, uh, just as other cultures think of other objects of the woman's anatomy as sexual. So he describes the tresses of the beloved. But of course, he is still sticking to Sufism. But in Hafiz, you can perhaps confuse the uh, idea of the beloved as God and the idea of the beloved as the lady you love.
Exactly, the confusion between the sacred and profane, or the sacred and the carnal forms of love. Uh, there are many short as well as longer poems of love from Rumi's works that you've translated. And since we are talking so much about love and this such a deep connection between Sufism and love, I was wondering if you want to read out one or two individual poems that you are particularly fond of.
What sort of poem would you like?
Well, poems of love where Rumi is talking about where these kind of quotes come into play.
Okay. Here's a very short one. You are the joy that dances in my breast, my secret love that's hidden from the rest. The miser's coin that sometimes leaves the purse, so you escape and give birth to my verse. Yeah. Uh, yes. About love. Yeah. To proclaim his peace, God sent a dove. This messenger of mystery is called love. Love herself, though mother of all men, is the child of faith, and only when our faith in him is strong, she will be seen as moons emerge from out of their cloudy screen. And when your faith in love is waning low, she'll wait behind her veil for faith to grow.
Uh, we definitely want more readings as part of the session. I wanted to take you back to the mistranslations, the bad translations that we talked about earlier in our program. Now, not just the Americans, but many of the Western sort of interpreters have fallen into that trap, perhaps Madonna included. Uh, but when you're talking about fidelity and you're talking about keeping the semblance of the music, of that magic of Rumi, as well as the cadence, as well as the rhymes, I wanted to maybe give something which is very, very common. So even from an Indian Desi standpoint, we know. I mean, one of the most famous ghazals of Rumi that's been immortalized in song, in performative music, either in a ghazal form or in qawwali form, is where Rumi is talking about, naman behuda girde, kucha bazar migurtam, etc. Right? And there is a line there where he says, Bia jana inayat kun, bia jana jane jana, right? And I was wondering that Persian is such an intricate and subtle language, the language of symbols, the language of hidden and secret meanings, that you take a very simple word like Bia. It could mean an official summons, that the Sultan has summoned you, Bia, come here. I'm commanding you to my presence. It could be an invitation, Bia, again. Or it could be the supplication or the pleading that Rumi uses. Bia, come to me, appear unto me, else I will perish. And you see a lot of this in in Amir Khusro, for instance, right? Yaraman Bia Bia Balabam Rasida Janam to Bia is in the man, and if you come to me, then I will somehow be miraculously saved, else I will just die. So therefore appear unto me, come to me. I mean, just taking something as simple and as complex a word as Bia, right? When you were translating that, I'm wondering how would you contextualize it? Because that same word Bia would, in Rumi sense, means so many different things depending on the context and depending on the characters and the voices who are using that word Bia, or Ishq or Zindagi. How did you go about sort of interpreting from a contextual standpoint? In this context, I think this is how Bia should be, while reading the original sort of melody of that verse.
Well, when I was working at it, I would work sometimes face to face with my friend Firdaus Ali, who knew Persian backwards, and he would say this word could mean that and could mean that, and but then I'd say, what is the sentence? What's the context in which it is delivered? And then I would be looking for the exact kind of to put it into the rhythm and the rhyme of of uh, of what the entire meaning would be. The word would suggest itself as having that particular meaning in that particular spot. So that was never a problem. Now, Avik, we've talked about love and God and so on, but the Masnavi, right? The Masnavi is absolutely full of parables, of story poems, right? And some of them are pretty crude. They're quite mischievous, mentioning genitals and this and that and the other. Uh, what happened to me was in one attempt to publish a poem, the publisher said to me, "No, you can't have this. It's much too vulgar." And I said, "That's what Rumi wrote. What am I to do?" Yeah, and it had allusions to uh, genitals, this, that, and the other, and they wouldn't have it. So that poem remains on the computer and hasn't been published. So it happened a couple of times. But the other story poems are parables, just as Jesus would use parables. Um, Rumi used stories to to convey the meaning of the Sufi philosophy.
And I'm just
I
on
could
that.
read one or two if you want me to.
Do you have the flight of Isa? Because Isa is Persian for Jesus, right? I think that's one of the poems that you translated about Jesus, or any of the biblical poems. If you have that at hand, I think that'd be great if you could read out for us, please.
Shall I read you one which has no religious meaning until you begin to see what it is? Yeah, it's called Painters. Greeks from the west and Chinese from the east were invited to the Sultan's great feast. The Sultan, being a man of many parts, was interested in sport and in the arts. The rival painters from east and west began to argue about who could best do justice to the senses, who could paint the truthful artifact that would acquaint the beholder with wonder. Painting should seduce and teach if it were any good. So leave behind your rivalry and start, the Sultan said, to demonstrate your art. He assigned to each group a studio and challenged each of them in time to show the skills they boasted. The Chinese asked the king for 1,000 colors. The Greeks asked nothing but stuff they said they'd use to clean the rust. Then from their studio out came clouds of dust. Each day, the studios were contiguous and were separated by a heavy, bland grey curtain. The Sultan did then assign to both the delegations a deadline. And finally arrived the judgment day. The king ordered in turn they should display what they had done. And so first the Chinese unveiled their work, exquisite expertise, was portrayed on the walls for all to see. The Sultan was impressed and publicly rewarded these artists who could portray the earth, the sky, and even winds at play. The painting was an obvious delight, which silenced speech and mesmerized the sight of all who gazed upon it. Now the team of Greeks were called, even though it did seem that nothing could outclass that Chinese art. The king ordered the curtain drawn apart, and it was done. There was no paint upon the walls, but they were polished and they shone like mirrors made of silver, shiny, pale, reflecting the painting in each detail perfectly. The Sultan could see this art was like an installation of the heart, because the pure heart in reflection can display the works of God and not of man.
Amazing. Absolutely brilliant.
No,
Absolutely brilliant.
that. It's from the Masnavi, and it's a story poem, and it you don't see what's happening right till the last couplet, and then you see what he's trying to say.
And if you compare the poetic forms of expression, we talk about that presently, but if you compare the approach towards poetry, would you say that this was fairly common in Rumi's days, or in the centuries that, you know, you're talking about Saudi, or you're talking about Hafiz, or in Hindustan, in India, you talk about Amir Khusro? Is this form of the story poem something that would necessarily involve the deliberation that, okay, I'm going to keep people guessing, keep people in suspense, and right at the end, if something shall be revealed through a riddle, or through a clue? Or is that, in your reading, do you find that to be far more exclusive, far more peculiar to Rumi himself?
Well, Ruby's work is so prolific. No other poet has ever written in that kind of volume. Some people call the Masnavi the Quran in verse. Um, it's it's different from that, right? Of course, it embodies what the Quran is trying to say in that sense. But he also writes, apart from 6 volumes of the Masnavi, he writes the ghazals, which he calls Diwane Shamsu Tabriz, right? And that is the book devoted to his peer, to Shams. And that's almost all ghazals, really, love poems. And they talk about uh, you know they talk about devotion, and that whole book is devotion, but the variety within the Mastavi of 10 different forms. Some are aphorisms, some are stories and parables in exactly the same way that other religious people would. you know Someone could compare to Jesus's parables, someone could compare to Panchatantra, one could compare to Aesop's fables. There are all sorts of stories there, but then there are aphorisms, there are devotional poems, there are poems of love, and through the 24,000 verses, it just rumbles on. So you can find almost anything you want in the Rumi works, which is not true of Khusro or Hafiz even, yeah, or other poets.
We talked about various forms of expression, various motives, various subjects, and just apropos of that, I think it'll be great for our viewers and for our audience to be presented with a glimpse, with the flavor of that. So if you were to read out, some examples of these different forms or modes of expression that Rumi is using to convey a particular message, that would be delightful.
Okay, um, I haven't marked them, but here is one that's very simple. It's addressed to Muslims. It says, O pilgrim who visit the Holy Land, I'll show you heaven in a grain of sand. Why traverse deserts? Why confront the storm if within you resides the formless form of the beloved? If he's in your heart, your pilgrimage has ended where you start. So from that garden did you bring a rose? You saw the house of God. Now just suppose, arriving at a house unoccupied, will leave the pilgrim's thirst unsatisfied. Remember Haji, wherever you roam, his love will have to make your heart his home. Yeah, that's that's one kind of verse. Um, yes, yes, it's called Lovers. Lovers and love live for eternity. All else is borrowed, brother. Leave it be. Don't be enthralled to passing shows that fade. Embrace the thing that is of spirit made. Love gives you wings to fly up to that place, beyond the 100 veils of airy space. To be born, you must first renounce each breath, and on the journey turn towards that death that blinds you to the world and to the eye that tells you you are eternity's sigh. See, one of the themes of the Masnavi, one of the themes of Sufi poetry is stop thinking, begin to feel, right? And negate thoughts, negate logic, because logic can lead you into juridical Islam, whereas emotions can lead you to a unity with the beloved, a unity with God who is in your heart anyway. So always that. Yeah. Um, should I read another narrative
Yeah,
poem?
sure, sure, please.
Yeah. It's called The Grammarian and the Boatman. A grammarian, needing to get across a wide river, hired himself a boat, directing the boatman to a remote destination. Then, being at a loss for intellectual stimulus, he turned to the young handsome boatman as he rowed, and extracting some book of grammar, showed the boatman a theorem he'd discerned of great grammatical complexity, asking the young man what grammar he knew. Sir, I know nothing beyond two and two make four, the boatman said quite brazenly. Then you've lived only half a life, young man, the grammarian said in his haughty way. And as he said this, clouds darkened the day, and in the waters a whirlpool began to stir the river and threaten the boat. The boatman with a smile turned to him. So, philosopher, I hope you can swim. The chance we'll get to shore is now remote. Of course I can't, the pompous man replied. Then you've wasted not half, but all your life, the boatman said. No intellectual strife will save you from the rising tide. Obliteration of the self will prove solution in dissolution your mind. Reflecting grammar and logic will find it cannot grasp how worlds and times do move. So there is the negation of the intellect, as it were.
Do you think that there is quite a bit of autosuggestion in this particular poem? And I'll take you back to something that you've articulated in great detail in your introduction, and maybe we can talk about that as well before we move on to, Sufi doctrines or principles of Islam as opposed to dogmatic ones, and probably then open up for questions. Uh, this particular poem reminded me of the time that Shamsi Tabriz is meeting Rumi for the first time. And at that point of time, Rumi is not the, the, the denouncer of dogmas, right? He's very much the intellectual, he's very much the grammarian, and he's teaching his class, right? with piles of books. And right at from the end, right at the back, there's this really absolutely ragged, decrepit man dressed in rags, who we later realize is Shams Tabriz, right? And I think it'll be great for you if you continue the story from that point. He says, what are these books, right? What are these on the table?
And the Ruby's lecture has been interrupted by this tramp. And he says, "What are these?" And Ruby says, "They are not things that you will understand." At which point, he turns to the books and sees that they are all in one big blaze of flame. And he says, "Oh my God, what's this?" And Shamsu Tabriz replies, "It's not something that the likes of you will understand." And he turns away. The books are still there, but Shamsu Tabriz leaves. Ruby leaves his class and pursues this fellow and says, "Who the hell are you? What was that about?" And then they retreat. It is said they retreat for 40 days without food or water and talk to each other. And Ruby comes out quite transformed and in Mevlevi dancing and says, "Find unity in your soul, not in books and study." All that sort of stuff. So, of course, it's legendary, I don't suppose they would ask for.
There's so many parallels, of Christ in the desert and his passion, his passion of faith, and wrestling with Satan. That is one aspect of it, and the other, of course, is the transformation of
Yeah,
Rumi, the intellectual, into Rumi, the Kalandar. I think that is pivotal, which came out very well in the introduction in much detail. Uh, there's one other theme, and I'll take you back to the poem that he addresses the pilgrims, the Muslims, those of faith. I think it's fair to say, and we have discussed this in our exchange, but I just wanted to bring this up, is Sufism, from a philosophical standpoint, is also a response, is also presenting an alternative to the dogmatic orthodoxy of Islam. And it's Sufism entire the Persian Empire back in the day, or anywhere where it had Persian influence. For example, you know that in India, one of the great Sufi princes and the person who never could become emperor was Dara Shikoh, right? And he belonged to the Qadri sect, and he was very influenced by the Chishtis and very influenced by Rumi's poetry. And he would always advocate the Allaga Islam as opposed to Mullaka Islam, something that was very controversial in his day and got him into big trouble. But today, if you're looking at the geographical construct, right, the geographical terrain of where Rumi and much of his life revolved around, and his influence from a theological standpoint, from a poetic standpoint, is unfortunately overrun by forces that have fallen victim to Islamic fundamentalism. If you look at the world today, does this mean that the great Sufi experiment has failed, or will the long arm, the longue durée of history surprise us? And if so, what do you see would be forms of reviving, the pure ethos, the pristine ethos of Sufism in our times?
Well, I think what Rumi is saying is that faith, devotion, a negation of book learning and logic, that kind of devotion, if it comes from the heart, is what is required by all religions. Here's a poem. It says, "All religions are one." Very strange saying. When the righteous, regardless of faith, invoke the prophets who direct the soul, to him they are like wine from several cups, poured to mingle and fill a single bowl. Their praises are directed to the one, so all prayers and religions are the same, directed ultimately to one light of him, regardless of the earthly name that one or other religion may use, To praise the one, though some in error fall into mistaking the radiance of light from the moon reflected on a blank wall for the light from the radiant moon itself, or seeing its reflection in a well, they mistake its image for the real thing and worship it. Only the moon can tell if this worship, being for a reflection, is idolatry leading prayers astray. Are all images condemned as idols, forbidden to the worshipful who pray? It's a question.
And I could so easily listen to your readings for the next hour, but being mindful of the time and not being so selfish, and in the hope that this also gives us an excuse to get you back to Canto uh, on future editions. This has been absolutely wonderful, Farrukh, talking to you about Rumi, learning from you, being immersed in the music, even in the translated form, because you've held on, you've preserved the cadence, the music, the rhyme, in that search for fidelity, which was so heartening for all of us. And thank you so very much. Are there any sort of concluding thoughts or a final poem maybe that you want to read out before we close out this particular session?
Famous poem of Rumi. It's called Song of the Reed. Yeah, you must have said there are several translations of it. Oh, let the grieving of the reed be heard. It sings of the parting it has suffered. I was from the bed of reeds rudely rent. O humans, resonate in my lament. To the breast that has suffered separation, this cry of parting is a sad libation. The one who finds himself so far from home thinks only of the day he will come home. I wandered in gatherings of men who were sorrowful, though some were happy too. And though from among those I made the best of friends, I kept my secret in my breast. My secret is the essence of this grief, to which no sight or sound can bring relief. Our bodies give our souls a sanctuary, and yet the soul remains a mystery. The flute's music is not man's breath but fire. This fire is love, the essence of desire. The turbulence of love is in the wine. Those not on fire will never know love divine. The reed is the voice of all who are love lorn. Its melodies ensure all veils are torn. All opposites are one. Disease and cure is the reed's longing for pure love impure. The reed sings the song that broke Majnu's heart, the song of belonging and being torn apart. The sense is senseless to all that has occurred. The sensitive ear is receptive to the word. Though worldly attachments days turn into nights, rendering as longings all our appetites. Though time makes the ages, don't fear growing old. Let all that is holy before your eyes unfold. The fish that's born to water needn't fear a flood, for the hungry human weakens thins the blood. Weakness thins the blood. Raw meat can't predict the taste of cooked sauce. So farewell. That's the end of this discourse.
Full poem to conclude the session on. Thank you so much. It's been my personal privilege and honor to be sharing the screen with you. This has been an enchanted hour in your company, albeit virtual. And thank you so much. This has provided us, please, sanctuary for this 1 hour from the trials and tribulations of the post-truth world. So thank you so very much. A big round of applause for Farrukh Dhondy. Thank you so much for being a part again. Bye for now.